Welcome to the safety portion of your firearms training with Safe Insight. The first thing we want to talk about when we're talking about firearms safety is who is responsible for safety. We hear many times people say, well, I want to learn how to safely handle and operate a firearm. But then when it comes down to mishaps with firearms, people have all kinds of excuses. Oh, I thought the gun was unloaded, or I thought the safety was on, or even I was just cleaning the gun when it went off. But when it comes to safety, who is responsible? You. As a firearm handler and or owner, you are the one that is ultimately responsible for safety. You are the one that decides whether or not that firearm has an unintentional discharge. And only you can do this by handling the firearm in a safe manner. So the first thing we want to discuss when it comes to handling firearms safely is that we never handle a firearm under the influence of alcohol and or drugs, even prescription drugs that cause you drowsiness, because it's imperative that we have our full mental faculties available to us when handling a firearm so that no mistakes occur. Physically, while handling the firearm, we want to be confident in the skills that we have. But at the same time, mentally, we don't want to be overconfident or sure of ourselves that no mistakes could ever happen. The overall mindset that we should maintain is that we are expecting the firearm to go off. So in line with this, we're going to talk about the universal firearm safety rules. What are the universal firearm safety rules? Well, these are rules that are used by militaries, law enforcement, and public ranges all across the world. They are universal in the sense that they apply to all firearms at all times. Following these 4 universal rules can keep you from having a mishap with a firearm. The 4 rules are that all guns are always loaded. Never point a gun at anything you are not willing to shoot or destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. And finally, be aware of your target, your backstop, and beyond. Now, as we went through those, we went kind of rapidly and we named off the 4 universal firearm safety rules. And these are all used in some form or another throughout trainings across the world. But do you remember those 4 firearm safety rules? Well, we asked that as a question to get you thinking, because what we found through years of training is that many people, while they'll hear the firearm safety rules in their training, they don't really sink in, and they don't really truly remember them. In fact, among firearm professionals, it's not uncommon to walk in for a training and begin with the 4 universal firearm safety rules and say, who can tell me what the 4 universal firearm safety rules? And typical responses are, well, there's something about the finger. Remember, the finger needs to be safely put somewhere. And something about a gun is loaded. I can't remember the other 2. That's a common reaction, even among professionals, unfortunately. So here at Safe Insight, we developed something to try to help people remember the safety rules, and this is the SAFE rules. The SAFE rules are the 4 universal firearm safety rules placed into the acronym SAFE. So rule number 1 is S, suppose the gun is always loaded. A, aim the firearm in a safe direction at all times. F, finger off the trigger until you are ready for a bullet to come out. And E, everything in the path of the bullet has to be accounted for. So if you think about it, this really breaks down the 4 universal firearm safety rules and correlates with each one. Suppose all guns are always loaded, obviously goes with all guns are always loaded. Aim the firearm in a safe direction at all times correlates with never point the gun at anything you are not willing to shoot or destroy. Finger off the trigger until you are ready for a bullet to come out is related to never put your finger on the trigger until your sights are on the target. And finally, everything in the path of the bullet accounted for is the same as be aware of your target, backstop, and beyond. Everything that's in line with your bullet, you have to be responsible for ultimately. Let's break down these safety rules. And let's use a SIRT pistol to talk about these and why they're so important. Now this SIRT pistol, as you can see, is made of hardened plastic. It's a training pistol. It has not a moving slide. It does not operate. It's impossible to get around in or out of this weapon. As we eject the magazine, you can see that it's made of hardened plastic. There is no way for a bullet to get in or out of here. And even though you can't really see it, deep down inside there is no way for a bullet to get into the chamber or the barrel. So this is completely a training pistol. Now what this gun does is when you press the trigger, it shoots a laser. So it tells you where you shot, but it does it in a safe manner. So as we use this gun to demonstrate the safe rules, we're going to talk about each part, break it down, and why it's important. First off, there's S. Suppose all guns are always loaded. As you can see, this gun, again, is incapable of firing a bullet. Yet you'll notice while handling this gun, I'm not taking it and pointing it at my face and seeing what's down the barrel. I'm not waving it around on my finger or pointing it over in unsafe directions, waving it all around. I'm treating this gun as a loaded gun. Why? Because it's shaped like a gun. Therefore, in my mind, I want to treat it as a loaded gun, supposing it is loaded. Next, we're going to talk about aiming the gun in a safe direction at all times. You'll notice right now I'm pointed down at the ground. Now here in this training environment, this is a relatively safe location. However, pointing the gun in a safe direction at all times kind of depends on where you're at, because while pointing down at the ground in this location is relatively safe, if I were, say, on a second-story apartment building, would it be safe to point down at the ground? Well, no, because obviously I'm pointing at my neighbors below me. So while handling a firearm, you have to constantly be reevaluating what a safe direction to aim is. Next, we're going to talk about the finger off the trigger. You'll notice that I'm not putting my finger onto this trigger. My trigger finger is staying clear of it the entire time. When I say finger off the trigger, what I really mean is that my finger should be indexed on the frame of the weapon. This is the frame up here. I'm indexed or pushed up against the frame of the weapon. You see I'm nice and flush there on that frame. Now this does a couple of things. Number one, it makes it a lot harder for me to slip onto the trigger, as opposed to if I just put it over here on the trigger guard. You see how easy I could slip onto the trigger. The second thing that it does is it allows everybody around me to see that I'm being safe. Let's pretend that we're out at the range shooting together and you're standing next to me. And you see me out firing my rounds, bang, 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 and then I come down and I put my finger on the trigger guard. Is it very clear to you that my finger is off the trigger? Well, no. But if I'm up firing, bang, bang, and I take my finger off the trigger and come down, you can see the entire time that my finger is off that trigger. It gives you confidence that I'm handling my firearm in a safe manner. Finally, we're going to talk about E, everything in the path of the bullet accounted for. Do you know how far the average handgun round can fly if it's unimpeded? Well, the average handgun round can travel about a mile if it was unimpeded. So that's a lot of property to be responsible for, right? So we want to be responsible for everything in the path of the bullet, meaning what we're shooting at, the target, what's behind it, the backstop, what's going to stop our bullet, and what's beyond that, just in case the bullet doesn't stop in the backstop for some reason. Now, while you're at a shooting range, if you point in the direction that they ask you to point in, they've taken care of that for you. You've got everything in the path of the bullet accounted for. You simply aim at your target as directed by the range rules, and then the bullet will take care of itself because they have a backstop and they have a safety backstop as well if that doesn't work. Also, if you're at a range, it's probably expected that you think the guns you're touching are loaded because, after all, you're there to shoot them, right? But two critical rules to keep in mind, and these should always be the forefront in your mind when handling a firearm, is aiming the gun in a safe direction and finger off the trigger until you're ready for a bullet to come out. Let's talk about these two real quick in conjunction with one another. If I have my finger off the trigger, indexed as we talked about, and I'm aimed in a safe direction at the ground like we talked about, can I accidentally shoot my sign back here? Well, no. I've got my finger off the trigger and I'm pointed at the ground. It's impossible to shoot my sign without making an additional movement, correct? But if I accidentally point at my sign while keeping my finger off the trigger, can I accidentally shoot my sign right now? Well, again, the answer is no, not without an additional movement. It would take me removing my finger from the frame and putting it on the trigger in order for a bullet to be able to come out. So what this does is it allows me to be a human, make a mistake, violate a safety rule, aiming in an unsafe direction, and recover from it by going, whoa, 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 what am I doing? Let me get this gun pointed back in a safe direction. And it keeps me from having no damage take place because I was able to recover, because I was following both of those safety rules in conjunction with one another. Now, corresponding to that, if I keep my gun pointed in a safe direction here at the ground, but I accidentally put my finger onto the trigger. Now my finger's on the trigger, but I'm pointed in a safe direction at the ground. Am I accidentally going to shoot my sign right now? No, it's impossible because I'm not pointed in the direction of the sign. So what it does, again, is it allows me to be a human, make a mistake, and say, whoa, 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 let me get that finger off the trigger, and I can recover with minimal to no damage being done. So following those two rules at all times will keep you from having an accidental discharge. Remember that the only safety you can count on with a firearm is this, your brain. Your brain is what keeps things safe by telling you to keep it aimed in a safe direction and telling you to keep your finger off the trigger. Now we're going to talk about one of the most critical places that people violate the rule of putting the finger on the trigger. And I can tell you that this happens quite frequently, not only with new shooters, but even with experienced ones, putting the finger on the trigger. And it's not because people are inherently bad or they just don't want to follow the rules. It's because this gun is designed to be very comfortable and ergonomic for the finger to fit on the trigger, right? That's the go button for this machine. So with the gun being designed for our finger to fit on the trigger, it actually becomes something you have to consciously think about to keep your finger off the trigger. In fact, it's not uncommon to see people accidentally put their finger on the trigger and say, whoa, 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 get your finger off the trigger, and they'll go, oh, it was off the trigger. And you see oh, it was off the trigger. They move it off because they really think that it is off the trigger, but it's clear that it actually goes onto the trigger at times without them realizing it. So again, it takes very conscious focus to keep that finger off the trigger. And here's where it takes the most focus. Let's say we're out at the shooting range. I'm pointing down range again, and I'm down taking my shots, and I'm going bang, 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 and I go, hey, I wonder where my shots went. Hey, where'd they go on the target there? Do you see the problem here? When I come down to peek over and see where my bullets went, am I ready for a bullet to come out right now while I'm peeking at the target? No. And you'll see this many times, especially at indoor ranges. You'll see marks on the ground, either down on the floor or up on the ceiling, where people have done either this, where'd it go, or wonder where it went. And they left their finger on the trigger and accidentally had a discharge. So when we're shooting, what we need to do is we need to point in, shoot, and then finger off the trigger, come down to see where those shots went. Back on target, finger back on the trigger, finger off the trigger, back off target. Even if it's just a slight movement, that finger should come off the trigger. Now let's talk about how to safely store a firearm. There are many storage alternatives available to keep a gun secured. One of the most common ones, obviously, is a safe. But there's also the trigger lock and the cable locks that can be used in order to keep firearms from accidentally getting into the wrong hands or being used inappropriately. So what is the best way to store a firearm? Well, that all depends on you. It depends on your circumstances. So what we have to evaluate before we determine what the best storage solution for you is to find out what you're trying to accomplish with your storage goals and how you can most effectively do that. So the first thing we want to remember is the goals of storage are what? They're to keep the firearm out of the hands of children, first and foremost. Secondly, they're to keep the firearm out of the hands of what we like to call grown children. I'm sure you all have somebody you know, that person that you wouldn't trust with things in your house because they're like a grown kid and they just do things without thinking. So we want to keep it out of the hands of grown children or irresponsible adults. Also, we want to make the firearm as difficult as possible for somebody to steal. Now, why do we say difficult as possible? Well, because it's obviously not, there's no way for us to secure something to make it impossible to steal. If you have a determined criminal, they will find a way to get to that firearm, unfortunately. Now, we can say this, if people can hack into some of the top security systems in the world, then we know that there's no way for us to securely assure that a gun cannot be taken. So we make it as difficult as possible for somebody to take that firearm. And finally, fourth, we need to evaluate our needs for that firearm, having it accessible for the needs that we have it for. So for instance, if I have that gun for taking to the range and shooting on occasion for sport or to do in competitions, maybe that's not a self-defense gun. Then it's probably okay for me to go ahead and disassemble that gun, put a trigger lock on it, and throw it in the safe because I don't need it. But if I'm counting on that firearm for self-defense or defending my home, now I have to reevaluate how I'm going to secure that. So putting a trigger lock on it or a cable lock might not be the most efficient way for me to store it. Perhaps it's some type of a safe that is more efficient for me. But either way, you as an individual have to decide what your storage goals are, the four we talked about, and then you have to decide what is the best way to store it for your personal needs. Keeping it out of the hands of people that shouldn't have it, but keeping it ready to be in your hands the times you do need it. Once you've decided which way you want to store the firearm, it's important that you know what condition to store it in. If you plan on using it, then you want to keep it in a loaded condition, ready to go for your self-defense or home defense needs. But if you're not going to be using the firearm for a while, then it's important that you clean the firearm thoroughly and lock it up and store it away in order to keep it from deteriorating or corroding on you while being stored. Here at Safe Insight, something that we put a lot of emphasis on with our safety training is lead exposure. We're very passionate about this because unfortunately we've seen firsthand some of the effects that overexposure to lead can have on people, some of our counterparts. So we take that very seriously and we feel it's our duty to teach you about lead exposure before you go to the range. How do you get lead exposure? Well, lead exposure comes in three forms. It comes through inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. Inhalation, obviously, being where you inhale it through your nose or your mouth. Ingestion, where you maybe eat it off your fingers, some particles that are on your hand, or some other way it gets into your mouth. And absorption, where it just gets on your skin and absorbs into the skin and the bloodstream. What are some of the side effects or symptoms of lead exposure? Well, the symptoms can be numerous and they could often be confused with other things, but some of the more common ones are headaches, depression, insomnia, nausea and vomiting, and it can also cause some reproductive problems because lead exposure affects and attacks the digestive system, the reproductive system, and the nervous system, all three. So how can you protect yourself from lead exposure? Because after all, we are shooting lead bullets out of our firearm. So there's lead that comes out of our firearm. There's lead that gets into the air, particles of it, because it's leaving traces of it behind as it fires. So some of that can be inhaled, some of that can be absorbed, Some of that could be ingested if we were putting our hands in our mouth while we're at the range. So we're going to give you a few tips to keep you from experiencing lead exposure. Now, again, there's going to be minimal amounts, trace amounts that you're going to get just from being at the range. And it's okay. Our body naturally has some lead in it. It's just that you don't want the levels to get very high, so you want to try to keep those minimized. So how can you minimize your exposure? Well, when you're at the range, first and foremost, don't eat anything, don't drink anything, and don't smoke anything in the range environment. This keeps you from getting your hands up in your mouth, and this will help you prevent ingestion of the lead particles. Finally, while you're at the range, wear a hat if at all possible, because by wearing a hat, you keep those lead particles from absorbing into your scalp. So that's another way you can protect yourself. Now, what about when you're done shooting? When you're done shooting, you want to immediately wash your face and hands, and you want to wash them with soap and cold water. And you want to do that with your face, your hands, and any other area of exposed skin that you might have while you're shooting. Why do we say cold water and not warm water? Because warm water tends to open up the pores, and it allows that lead to absorb in easier, whereas cold water tends to close up the pores, and it allows you to easier wash the lead off of the top of your skin. Finally, when you're done shooting at the range, you want to make sure to blow your nose really well. I know this sounds kind of gross, but it's important to do because you've been inhaling some of those lead particles into your nose, and fortunately we have these mucous membranes inside that try to trap most of that lead that comes in there. So it helps you to get rid of it and expel it by blowing your nose when you're done at the range. And finally, when you go home, some of the precautions you can take is immediately take your shoes off that you had on at the range. This is important because you don't want to track lead through your carpet, especially if you've got kids at home that may be crawling around on the carpet. So you want to get those shoes off right away. Next, you want to make sure that you take all of your clothes that you were wearing at the range and get them in the washing machine and washed up, because you don't want those lead particles falling off on your furniture and on your loved ones as they come up to touch you and hug you. And finally, before going to bed at night, make sure you wash your hair really well, because again, the lead particles tend to stick to the hair follicles and they can absorb in. And also, while they're on the hair, if you go to bed at night that way, it can get all over your pillowcase and your blankets, and then you've got lead all over your bed, and you just don't want that. So very important that you wash your clothes immediately after being at the range. Following these suggestions will help you to greatly minimize your lead exposure and hopefully protect you from ever experiencing any symptoms of lead exposure.